think one of the things that I missed the most about life before the pandemic is live sports. Now, for those of you that aren't sports fans, you won't understand what I'm talking about, but there's something about watching sports that I just really enjoy and that I really miss in terms of life and things to talk about with people and things that I enjoy. And as a Toronto Maple Leaf fan, about the most impossible thing to ask me to do in the world is to cheer for one of Toronto's rivals. Now, historically, Toronto's rival has been, of course, the Montreal Canadiens, but it's been a long time since those two teams have been good at the same time. And so currently, if I had to pick a rival, that team that I just can't cheer for, no matter who they're playing, that team would definitely be, unfortunately, the Boston Bruins. Sorry, TJ. They've beaten Toronto in the playoffs a couple of times. They've beaten them in the regular season. They've made them look bad. And they've kind of almost dashed my hopes and dashed my dreams for what the Leafs could do and what they could accomplish. So as we've been going through Jeremiah, I just want to point out how hard it is for us to conceive of how the words and actions of Jeremiah would have been perceived in a setting where the outcome isn't already known. I mean, we read these words knowing that the exile was coming and what it looked like, and also with the knowledge that the exile ended. And so a post-exilic world, a world after the crisis of exile, is not an unknown for us like it would have been for the people originally living in Jeremiah's time. And since we never lived pre-exile, we don't really have anything in our experience of life to compare it to. Now, having gone through some samples of Jeremiah's diagnosis of the problem in Judah, of forgetting of Yahweh, and reading some of what the problem produced, inauthentic worship and lives lived inconsistent with the word and the laws of Yahweh, we then looked at the potter and the clay analogy and finally started to see some of the signs of hope. When we read it closely, the analogy that's being used in Jeremiah when he's talking about the potter and the clay reveals God's plan to use exile to reshape his people. His people who could not be made into the vessel that God originally intended, but into a new vessel that was still more suitable to house God's presence than all of the other vessels that were available in the world. Now, before the pandemic canceled our gatherings, the plan had been to next look at Jeremiah chapter 23, which made explicit reference and mention of the true king, Messiah, who was still to come. And Messiah, who would be a shoot from the line of David, would be unlike the current shepherds of Israel who had led the people astray. He would lead God's people into a new exodus, with a dual implication of the physical reality of leaving Babylon, but more importantly, a spiritual reality of a freedom from the bondage to idolatry and to sin. The things that had caused the exile in the first place. And so today, this morning, this afternoon with you, I want to talk just a little bit about one of the more famous passages in Jeremiah. It comes from Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 1 to 14. The NIV translation reads like this. The chapter is entitled, A Letter to the Exiles. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets, and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiakim and the queen mother, the court officials, and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the skilled workers and the artisans, had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elasah, son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And it said, This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Also seek the prosperity and peace of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Then you will call on me and come and pray to me, and I will listen to you. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. See, when we discussed this verse at our last communion time together on an In Sunday, we focused on the part that talks about the plans that God has for his people. Plans for shalom, for peace and prosperity and well-being and safety and fulfillment, and not for harm or, more literally, evil. But today I want to focus on an earlier part of the passage with some pretty controversial advice from Jeremiah to the exiles in Babylon. Now, to understand the true weight of what Jeremiah was saying in this letter, we have to remind ourselves that it was being written to a people who are already experiencing exile. They are living in the land that had besieged and destroyed and disrupted their way of life, leaving the symbols of their faith in ruin and living in a forced captivity. It was a captivity where they were free to a degree to live out their lives and free to worship their God within some constraints, but a captivity nonetheless, and most importantly, it was a captivity where the temple was no longer present. The symbol of God's presence with the people of Israel. Now, as I've implied before, the mental state of Israel at the time is best captured in Psalm 137, and it's a short psalm, so I'm going to read it here. Psalm 137 from the NIV translation says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.' How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." Their captors were perceived as mocking Israel. Some translations call it tormenting them. And the people of Israel were disillusioned and disoriented and confused. They had no idea how to worship in a foreign land where the temple wasn't there. And their hopes were clinging to the memory of Jerusalem and the memory of the temple, and in the assumption that vengeance would at some time come. In fact, some prophets who were in Babylon with those exiled were predicting that the current state of exile would last as little as 2 years. Now, it was into this that Jeremiah wrote an almost unconscionable and definitely controversial set of instructions, carried them after first establishing that it was God himself, and not Nebuchadnezzar as victor over God, that had carried them into exile in the first place. The instructions that were given to the people who were in exile were to build houses, to settle down, literally to sit down or to remain or to dwell. to plant gardens and then eat what they produce, to marry and have sons and daughters and to increase in number, and finally to seek the shalom of the city that they were in, and in fact to pray for that city and its shalom. Now the implication of the first parts of the instructions seem fairly clear. Exile was going to last a while. You don't invest time in building permanent homes, planting gardens that may take years to produce real fruit, forming families through marriage and having children and expanding and growing in number. You don't do those things if your stay isn't going to be a bit of an extended one. And later on in this passage, in verses I didn't read, God is specific through Jeremiah that the exile would last exactly 70 years. Now, as disappointing as these words might have been, perhaps Israel could have gotten past the disappointment and lived with God's timing if allowed to just stay separate, to build their homes and their communities and to grow their families and plant their gardens, just kind of walled off a little bit from the rest of Babylon, from the people whom they hoped would have vengeance enacted against them, to the point of the language of Psalm 137 of being joyfully celebrative of those who grabbed the infants of Babylon and dashed their heads against a rock. But the next part of the instructions made it clear that there was more to their extended stay than just that. They were told to seek. Literally, this word means to seek out in prayer, to seek out with care, to inquire of God. Or in some cases, this word is even used in a context that can mean to demand something of God. And what they were told to seek was the shalom of the city in which God had sent them. Again, emphasizing God's role in the exile. And in fact, to actively pray to God for the shalom of Babylon on their behalf. The same Babylon that had done unthinkable things to them, unthinkable things to their family, unthinkable things to their friends and their homes and their structures and their culture. Now, if we are to understand shalom properly, translated to English as peace, we don't understand this merely as tranquility and lack of conflict, but as we have discussed in the past, we understand shalom in terms of well-being, in terms of provision or being provided for, in terms of safety, and in terms of being in a mutual relationship with God. If this is what the people of Israel were to seek on behalf of Babylon, it seems pretty clear that this isn't just another way of stating that they should plan to stay for a little while. But instead, it's adding an active component to their extended stay in Babylon, one that asks them to be active in seeking and praying and bringing into being the well-being of the enemy that the Psalms written at the time indicate pretty clearly that they hoped to see destroyed. Now, there could be many reasons for such an instruction. The practicality of not making trouble, of not inciting a rebellion against Babylon that could only result in death and destruction for the people of Israel. You could point to the practicality of making things as normal as they could be while they were in captivity, to try to enjoy the best things of life that they could while they waited for their deliverance. You could point to the practicality of maybe being on their best behavior would result in them obtaining special privileges from the people of Babylon, to be put in places of influence or power, or at least to be left alone to live their lives the way that they wanted to live them, even while they were in captivity. But Jeremiah explicitly states that the reason for this controversial command is that in the shalom of Babylon, Israel would find their own shalom. And this implies a few new reasons for such an instruction. There is a missional impulse in this. Experiencing the shalom with Israel's God alongside Israel is a better example of Yahweh and who he is and the power that he has and the kind of God that he represents than any sermon could ever be. It goes back to Israel's original purpose when God formed them as a people. It was to worship him, yes, and to be in relationship with him and to serve him. But it was just to be as a beacon of hope and light for the nations around them so that they may look at Israel and ask a question about who it is that their God was and what it meant to serve him. By seeking the shalom of people that they would hope to destroy in human terms, and by living that shalom themselves, they could enact a part of bringing the kingdom of God to Babylon. There's the judicial impulse of this. That is to say that it recognizes that any vengeance on Babylon wouldn't come from the people of Israel. It wouldn't come from insurrection or resistance or rebellion, but it would come instead from God and God alone. And to seek the shalom for Babylon necessarily excluded taking any steps to enact their revenge. God and God alone is judge. Babylon was used as an instrument of God, and so whatever the consequences were for being that instrument were between God and Babylon, not between Israel and Babylon. And there's the spiritual impulse of this, which states for a people that were unsure how to worship in a foreign land, how to worship when they didn't have the temple that represented the presence of the people with them and in front of them that they could attend to. That worship of God isn't based on a building for God to live in, but a people within whom God could live. Let me say that again. It isn't based on the idea, worship isn't based on the idea that there is a building for God to live in, but it's based on the idea that there is a people within whom God could live. So I think God was trying to demonstrate to them that they could be his people no matter where they were. That he could be their people, that they could be his people, even in the midst of exile and destruction, and that they could be his people, and that he could be present with them, even if the temple was no longer there. Now I want you to realize that being asked to seek the shalom of Babylon is akin to asking a diehard Leaf fan to cheer for the Bruins, only 1,000,000 times more difficult. The last thing that those in exile would have wanted to do was to see the people of Babylon experience shalom with their God. Now sometimes I think when we look around at the world that we live in, not just now, but in better times, we experience a similar impulse where we don't feel like we belong, and where we hope that justice, a kind way of putting it, or vengeance, perhaps more of the way that we would put it if we weren't filtering it, is coming. But if God, through Jeremiah, can ask those in exile who had been destroyed and taken away and had family members killed and injured, if God can ask those people in exile to seek shalom for their captors and conquerors, how can we be asked for any less as we live our lives in Baden and New Hamburg and St. Jacobs and the other communities in which we live and in which we travel? God expects us to live in shalom with each other and to seek shalom of the lands that we're in, regardless of what kind of land they are, precisely because God wants to see his love demonstrated in the world, wants us to experience the world more like heaven than it was the day before, and wants us to demonstrate a hope that draws people towards him so that they can experience the same kind of shalom that God offers to all who call on his name. And one could say fairly accurately that our own experience of the shalom of God completely depends on the posture we take towards being and bringing the shalom of God to the communities around us.